The harsh fluorescent lights of the St. Jude Medical Center emergency ward flickered with a sterile, unforgiving hum, casting long, sickly shadows across the polished linoleum floor, where Clara Washington stood perfectly still, her hands still covered in the drying blood of a 7-year-old girl she had just pulled back from the absolute terrifying brink of death. Dr. Preston Vance, the chief of emergency medicine, a man whose perfectly tailored white coat cost more than Clara made in 3 months, marched down the corridor with his face flushed a violent shade of crimson, his expensive leather shoes slamming against the tiles like a gavel striking a judge's block. He did not look at the heart monitor that was now beeping with a steady, beautiful rhythm. He did not look at the little girl breathing peacefully on the gurney. He walked directly up to Clara, reaching out with a trembling, furious hand, and violently ripped the plastic identification badge right off her scrub top. The sharp snap of the plastic clip breaking echoed through the sudden, terrifying silence of the trauma bay. "You are fired, Washington." Vance spat, his voice a venomous hiss that carried across the room to where 6 other nurses and 3 junior residents stood completely frozen in fear. "You do not ever touch a scalpel in my hospital. You do not countermand my orders, and you certainly do not perform an unauthorized invasive procedure on a patient. You are a floor nurse. You change bedpans. You check blood pressure. You are nothing." Clara, a 32-year-old woman with dark, exhausted eyes and a posture forged from years of silent, unyielding endurance, did not flinch. She did not step back. She did not raise her voice. She looked down at the broken piece of plastic resting on the blood-stained linoleum, then slowly raised her eyes to meet Vance's frantic, terrified gaze. "She was dying, Dr. Vance," Clara said, her voice a low, calm baritone that completely exposed his panic. She was in acute cardiac tamponade. Her heart was drowning in blood. And you ordered a basic saline drip and a psychiatric consult for panic. You froze. And if I had waited for you to find your courage, that little girl would be in a body bag right now. Vance's face twisted with a mixture of absolute outrage and the deep, undeniable shame of a man who knows he has just been exposed as a complete fraud. "Security!" he screamed, his voice cracking as he spun around, looking at the silent bystanders. "Get this arrogant trash out of my ward immediately. Have her escorted off the property and flag her file. She will never work in medicine in this state again." 2 large security guards stepped forward, hesitantly looking at Clara with apologetic eyes. But Clara simply raised a hand, stopping them in their tracks. She carefully removed her blood-stained latex gloves, dropping them into the biohazard bin with a soft, definitive thud, untied her isolation gown, and walked past Vance without giving him another second of her time, leaving him standing in the center of the room, surrounded by a silence that felt entirely like an accusation. Man, I have to pause right here because my blood is literally boiling just watching this level of absolute, blinding arrogance play out. You have a man who almost killed a child because of his own incompetence, and his immediate reaction isn't to say thank you. His immediate reaction is to destroy the life of the woman who stepped up and did his job for him. He looks at Clara, and he sees a uniform. He sees a subordinate. He sees someone who doesn't matter. And he thinks he can just sweep his deadly mistake under the rug by throwing her out into the cold. But what Vance doesn't know, what nobody in that hospital knows, is that Clara Washington is not just a nurse. She is a dormant volcano of pure, hyper-competent brilliance. And the little girl she just saved is not just another random patient. Vance just handed Clara a termination slip, but he has absolutely no idea that he just signed his own professional death warrant. Let us get deep into this. To truly understand the absolute catastrophic magnitude of the mistake Dr. Preston Vance just made, you have to understand exactly who he just kicked out of his hospital and how she ended up wearing those faded blue scrubs in the first place. Clara Washington was not born in the United States. She was born in Nairobi, Kenya, where she was a prodigy, a brilliant surgical mind who possessed an eidetic memory for human anatomy and a terrifyingly calm demeanor under unimaginable pressure. She had graduated at the absolute top of her class from the best medical school on the continent, and by the time she was 28, she was the lead trauma surgeon at a massive urban hospital, saving lives every single day with hands that moved like a concert pianist. But when a violent civil conflict erupted, forcing her and her younger sister to flee the country as refugees, Clara sacrificed her entire prestigious career to secure their safety, arriving in America with nothing but a suitcase and an unshakable will to survive. The American medical system, however, is a massive bureaucratic fortress, protected by gatekeepers who care more about pieces of paper than actual life-saving competence. Because her credentials did not seamlessly transfer, and because she could not afford the hundreds of thousands of dollars and the years required to completely redo her residency, Clara took the only job she could get to put food on the table for her sister. She became a registered floor nurse. She swallowed her immense pride, she put away her surgical instruments, and she spent her days taking orders from doctors who possessed a fraction of her intellect and zero of her practical battlefield experience. She navigated the perilous, brutal ecosystem of the hospital hierarchy with a stoic, silent competence, fixing broken central lines, catching fatal medication errors before they reached the patients, and quietly whispering the correct diagnoses to junior residents so they could take the credit and save the lives without bruising the egos of the attending physicians. She became a silent guardian in the shadows, watching the hospital run, watching men like Preston Vance walk through the halls like gods, demanding worship from everyone in their path. Preston Vance was the exact opposite of Clara. He was a man born on third base who spent his entire life demanding people congratulate him for hitting a triple. He was the son of a prominent state senator, a legacy admission to a mediocre medical school, who had been handed the chief of emergency medicine position entirely because of his family's massive financial donations to the hospital board. Vance despised his patients, viewing them merely as stepping stones or inconveniences, aesthetic blights on his pristine corporate medical canvas. He was a man who prioritized hospital public relations metrics and his weekly golf handicap far above actual patient care. And he took a dark, sadistic pleasure in asserting his power over the nursing staff. He particularly hated Clara because, on some deep primal level, his fragile ego recognized her vastly superior intellect. He could feel the weight of her silent judgment every time he misdiagnosed a complex case. The escalation between them began months before the incident, when Vance had prescribed a massive dose of a powerful blood thinner to an elderly patient, failing to notice a pre-existing massive ulcer documented deep in the chart. Clara had caught the error, refusing to administer the drug, standing firmly between Vance and the patient until the furious doctor was forced to re-examine the chart, realizing she had just saved him from a massive malpractice lawsuit. Rather than thanking her, Vance had formally written her up for insubordination, ensuring her file was stained with disciplinary actions, assigning her the most grueling back-to-back night shifts, hoping she would quit out of sheer exhaustion. But Clara did not break. She did not complain. She simply endured the cruelty, showing up every single day, delivering flawless, compassionate care, her brilliant mind waiting in the dark. The day of the ultimate reckoning began as a chaotic nightmare. A massive multi-car pileup on the interstate had flooded the emergency room with critical trauma patients, pushing the staff to their absolute physical and mental breaking points. The bay doors crashed open, and paramedics wheeled in a 7-year-old girl named Lily, who had been pulled from the wreckage of a massive luxury SUV. Lily was pale, her breathing shallow and frantic, her skin cold to the touch. But she had no massive external bleeding or obvious broken bones. Because she had arrived in the chaos, separated from her parents, who were reportedly in a different ambulance, Vance took one quick, dismissive look at her perfectly intact, expensive clothes and her lack of visible gore, and immediately classified her as a low-priority panic response. "She is just hyperventilating from the shock," Vance shouted over the noise of the trauma bay, barely glancing at her monitor. "Give her a mild sedative, start a normal saline drip, and move her to curtain 4 to make room for the real bleeding traumas. We do not have time to hold hands today." Clara, standing beside the gurney, did not move. She looked at Lily's neck, noticing the distinct, terrifying distension of her jugular veins. She looked at the monitor, noting the paradoxically dropping blood pressure despite the rapid heart rate. And she listened to the muffled, distant sound of the child's heartbeat. "Dr. Vance, she is presenting with Beck's triad," Clara stated, her voice urgent but tightly controlled, cutting through the noise. "Her heart sounds are distant. Her pressure is narrowing. She has fluid accumulating in her pericardial sac. She is bleeding directly into the lining of her heart. She needs an immediate echocardiogram and an emergency pericardiocentesis." Vance stopped wiping the sweat from his forehead, whipping around to glare at Clara, his eyes burning with pure, arrogant fury. "Do not ever presume to diagnose a patient in my ward, Washington," he snarled, stepping into her space, pointing a finger directly at her face. "I am the chief of trauma. You are a glorified bedmaker. She has bruised ribs and an anxiety attack. You will follow my orders immediately, or I will have you removed from this building by force." Clara looked at him, her mind calculating the brutal mathematics of survival. She knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that if she followed his orders, that little girl would be dead in less than 4 minutes. Clara stepped back, appearing to submit, moving toward the supply cart, but she did not grab the sedative Vance had ordered. Instead, she quietly palmed a massive hollow-bore spinal needle, a heavy scalpel, and a specialized drainage syringe, sliding them into the deep pockets of her scrubs. 10 minutes later, while Vance was occupied screaming at a junior resident across the room, the alarms on Lily's monitor began to scream, a high-pitched, continuous wail that signaled imminent, catastrophic cardiac failure. Lily's eyes rolled back, her tiny chest seizing, her oxygen levels plummeting into the fatal zone, her heart physically crushed by the accumulating blood trapped inside the rigid sac surrounding it, unable to pump. Vance sprinted back to the cubicle, staring at the crashing numbers on the screen, his face draining of all color, his mind completely freezing as the reality of his catastrophic misdiagnosis hit him like a physical blow. "Push epinephrine, start chest compressions," Vance stammered, his voice shaking wildly, his hands hovering uselessly over the dying child, completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of his own deadly incompetence. "Compressions will kill her instantly. They will rupture the sac," Clara shouted, physically shoving the frozen doctor out of the way, stepping up to the bedside with the absolute commanding authority of a veteran trauma surgeon. She ripped open the sterile packaging of the massive needle, locating the exact, precise anatomical landmark just below the child's sternum with her bare fingers. "What are you doing?" Vance screamed, grabbing her shoulder. "You cannot do that. You are not a doctor. Stop her. Somebody stop her." Clara ignored him completely, tuning out the chaos, the screaming, the blaring alarms, her entire universe shrinking down to the tiny tip of that needle and the failing heart beneath the skin. With a swift, flawless, violent precision, she drove the massive needle directly into the child's chest, angling it perfectly upward, penetrating the tough, fibrous pericardial sac without touching the delicate beating muscle of the heart itself. She attached the syringe and pulled back the plunger, instantly drawing out a massive volume of dark, suffocating blood. releasing the lethal pressure. The monitor immediately responded, the flatlining tone, breaking into a steady, strong, rhythmic beep as the little girl's heart, finally freed from its cage, began to pump violently, bringing oxygen back to her starving brain. Lily took a sudden, massive, gasping breath, her color returning instantly, her life literally pulled out of the dark void by Clara's brilliant, unauthorized hands. The entire trauma bay went dead silent, staring in absolute shock at the floor nurse who had just performed a flawless, high-risk surgical intervention that most attending physicians would be terrified to attempt. Vance stared at the syringe full of blood, his entire worldview shattering, his authority completely undermined in front of his entire staff, his deadly mistake exposed for everyone to see. Rather than feeling relief that the child had lived, Vance felt nothing but a cold, venomous rage, a desperate, pathetic need to reassert his dominance and cover his tracks. Which leads exactly to the moment he ripped her badge off, firing her, publicly humiliating her, kicking her out into the cold night to protect his own pathetic, fragile ego. Clara walked out of the St. Jude Medical Center, the freezing wind cutting through her thin sweater, the automatic doors sliding shut behind her, sealing her out of the only career she had ever known. She walked the 3 miles back to her tiny, cramped apartment, her mind replaying the day, feeling the deep, bitter sting of a completely unjust universe, where saving a life was punished with total destruction. She sat alone in her dark living room, staring at the broken piece of plastic that used to be her identification badge, wondering how she was going to pay the rent, wondering how she was going to feed her sister, wondering if doing the right thing was always destined to end in tragedy. But what Clara did not know was that the universe has a highly specific, deeply ironic sense of humor, and the scales of justice were already violently tipping in her direction. You think she lost, right? You think the arrogant rich doctor won and the brilliant underdog was crushed by the system? But let me tell you something. You have absolutely no idea who that little girl's father is. While Clara was sitting in the dark, a massive, matte black Gulfstream G650 private jet was tearing through the night sky at 600 miles an hour, cutting through the storm clouds, banking sharply as it descended toward the city's private executive airport. Sitting in the luxurious leather cabin, staring out the window with eyes as cold and terrifying as absolute zero, was Julian Cross, the ruthless, brilliant billionaire founder and sole controlling owner of Cross Medical Innovations, the largest, most powerful medical technology and hospital holding conglomerate in the entire world. Julian Cross was a man who devoured corporations for breakfast, a man who commanded absolute, terrifying loyalty and possessed resources that made local politicians look like corner store managers. And Lily, the 7-year-old girl currently lying in the ICU at St. Jude, was his only daughter, the absolute center of his entirely ruthless universe. He had been thousands of miles away, negotiating a massive corporate merger when he received the call about the accident, and he had immediately mobilized his elite private medical team and flown straight into the storm. The private jet hit the tarmac with a violent screech of rubber thrust reversers roaring as the plane came to a halt, where a convoy of 6 heavily armored black SUVs was already idling on the runway, waiting. Cross stepped off the plane wearing a bespoke black suit, followed closely by Dr. Eris Thorne, the world's leading pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon, a man Cross retained on a staggering private salary. They did not speak. They climbed into the lead vehicle, and the convoy tore out of the airport, running every red light in the city, arriving at St. Jude Medical Center like a heavily armed invading army. The emergency room doors blew open, and Julian Cross walked in, flanked by massive security operatives, his presence instantly freezing the entire hospital staff in their tracks, his aura radiating a dark, terrifying gravity. Dr. Preston Vance, who had spent the last 3 hours frantically rewriting Lily's medical charts to completely erase Clara's involvement and position himself as the lone heroic savior, immediately spotted the billionaire and practically sprinted across the lobby, his face plastered with a nauseatingly obsequious smile.
Mr. Cross, thank God you are here.
Vance gushed, extending a sweating hand.
I am Dr. Vance, the chief of trauma. I am the one who personally saved your daughter's life. It was touch and go, but my quick thinking and my advanced surgical intervention pulled her through. She is resting comfortably in the VIP intensive care unit.
Cross did not look at Vance's extended hand. He did not slow his pace. He simply walked past the doctor as if he were a piece of furniture, heading straight for the elevators. "Take me to her," Cross commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that echoed off the linoleum. Up in the ICU, Lily was sleeping peacefully, hooked up to a dozen state-of-the-art monitors. Cross walked into the room, his cold eyes softening for a fraction of a second as he looked at his daughter, before he turned back into the ruthless corporate titan addressing his private surgeon. "Review the charts, review the telemetry. I want to know exactly what happened," Cross ordered. Dr. Eris Thorne stepped up to the bed, pulling the massive physical file Vance had doctored, while simultaneously pulling up the raw, unedited digital telemetry data on the room's main server using his elite access credentials. Vance stood nervously in the corner, sweating profusely, adjusting his expensive tie, desperately hoping his fabricated timeline would hold up under scrutiny. Dr. Thorne's eyes darted across the screens, analyzing the raw data, comparing the timestamps of the crashing blood pressure with the physical notes Vance had written. The room was suffocatingly silent, broken only by the steady rhythmic beep of Lily's monitor. Dr. Thorne stopped reading. He slowly lowered the chart and turned to look directly at Preston Vance, his eyes narrowing with a sharp, profound disgust. "You are a liar," Dr. Thorne said, his voice clear and ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. Vance's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "Excuse me? I am the chief of this ward. You cannot speak to me," like Vance started. But Dr. Thorne cut him off violently. "The raw telemetry shows the patient was in acute, fatal cardiac tamponade for 12 minutes before intervention," Dr. Thorne explained, turning to Cross. "This chart claims Dr. Vance initiated a standard pericardiocentesis, but the digital logs show he ordered a massive dose of sedatives and saline 3 minutes before the crash, an order that would have instantly killed her. Furthermore, the entry angle of the needle puncture wound on your daughter's chest indicates it was performed by a left-handed individual using a highly unorthodox battlefield trauma technique." Dr. Thorne pointed a sharp finger at Vance, who was right-handed and currently trembling visibly. This man froze. He misdiagnosed her. He nearly killed her. And then he falsified the medical records to cover up his catastrophic incompetence. "Someone else saved your daughter's life, Mr. Cross. Someone brilliant." Julian Cross turned his head slowly, locking his terrifying, dead eyes onto Preston Vance, the billionaire's face, an absolute mask of cold, murderous fury. "Who held the needle?" Cross whispered, his voice so quiet and so perfectly dangerous that the temperature in the room seemed to plummet 20 degrees. Vance backed up until his spine hit the wall, his arrogant facade completely shattering, exposing the weak, pathetic coward underneath. It was just a floor nurse," Vance stammered, tears of pure terror welling in his eyes. "She went rogue. She broke protocol. She was out of line. I had to terminate her employment to protect the integrity of the hospital. You have to understand, she was just a nurse." "She was just a nurse," Cross repeated the words, rolling off his tongue like poison. "You almost murdered my only child with your arrogance, And you fired the woman who stepped over your pathetic, freezing body to save her? Cross did not yell. He did not scream. He reached into his bespoke suit jacket, pulled out a sleek, encrypted satellite phone, and hit a single speed dial button. "Buy it," Cross said into the phone, his eyes never leaving Vance's terrified face. "Buy the entire St. Jude medical conglomerate, initiate a hostile takeover, leverage the Vanguard assets, purchase the board's voting rights. I don't care what it costs. Buy it. Right now." Vance slid down the wall, clutching his chest, his breathing shallow and rapid, his entire world collapsing in real time. Within exactly 12 minutes, the rapid-fire corporate execution was complete. The hospital's chief executive officer, flanked by 3 panicked corporate lawyers, practically sprinted into the ICU, breathless and sweating profusely. Mr. Cross, the CEO, panted. "We just received the emergency board notification. We had no idea this transaction was occurring. We are at your absolute disposal." Julian Cross pointed a single manicured finger at Preston Vance, who was now sobbing quietly on the linoleum floor. "Strip his medical license," Cross ordered, without a single ounce of mercy. "Fire him immediately. Ban him from every medical facility on this continent. Freeze his operational accounts, and contact the Federal Regulatory Commission. I want a full forensic audit of every single patient this parasite has ever treated in the last decade. I want him in a concrete cell by morning." The CEO did not hesitate. He gestured to Cross's massive security operatives, who immediately moved in, grabbing Vance by the arms of his expensive custom white coat, dragging him backward, out of the ICU, while he sputtered and begged. His entire career, his legacy, his identity, vaporized in the span of 15 minutes. The silent bystanders, the nurses and junior residents who had watched Clara get fired and said nothing, stood frozen in the hallway, watching the power dynamic violently, aggressively flip, knowing that their silence had made them complicit. Cross turned away from the door, dismissing the screaming doctor entirely, pulling his suit jacket straight. "Find her," Cross commanded, looking at the CEO. "Find the woman who held the needle and bring me to her. Immediately." 30 minutes later, Clara Washington was sitting at her tiny kitchen table, staring blankly at a stack of past-due utility bills, when the sudden, blinding glare of heavy headlights illuminated her small living room window. The screech of tires outside was followed by the heavy, synchronized slamming of armored car doors. Clara stood up, walking cautiously to the door, pulling it open to find her crumbling apartment building completely surrounded by massive black SUVs and heavily armed security personnel. Standing at the front of the pack, looking completely out of place on the cracked concrete sidewalk of her impoverished neighborhood, was Julian Cross. Clara recognized him instantly from the news. She knew exactly who he was, and she knew exactly why he was there. "You saved my world," Cross said, stepping forward, his terrifying corporate armor completely dropping, replaced by the raw, profound gratitude of a terrified father. "And the system tried to destroy you for it." Clara stood in the doorway, her posture stoic, her dark eyes tired but unbroken. "I was just doing my job, Mr. Cross," she replied, her voice quiet and factual. "A job they fired me for." Cross smiled, a sharp, dangerous, wolf-like smile. "They didn't fire you, Clara," he said softly, "because I just bought the company, and I am reorganizing the corporate structure. I have reviewed your actual credentials, your history in Nairobi, your flawless surgical record. The gatekeepers who kept you out have just been permanently removed." Cross reached into his jacket and pulled out a heavy, customized platinum identification badge, handing it out to her. It read, "Dr. Clara Washington, Chief of Trauma and Experimental Surgery, St. Jude Medical Center. I am fully funding your credential transfer. I am paying off your entire sister's educational debt, and I am giving you absolute autonomous control over the entire surgical division of my new hospital," Cross stated, his voice echoing with absolute finality. No more gatekeepers, no more arrogant legacy hires, just pure, undeniable competence. You will never have to hide your brilliance in the shadows ever again. Clara looked at the heavy platinum badge gleaming in the dim porch light, reading the title she had sacrificed everything to earn. The title the universe had tried to violently strip away from her. She did not cry. She did not fall to her knees. She simply reached out and took the badge, her fingers gripping the cold metal with a fierce, unyielding strength. "I have conditions," Clara said, looking directly into the billionaire's eyes, completely unfazed by his massive wealth. Cross laughed, a loud, booming sound of pure, unadulterated approval. "I would expect nothing less, Dr. Washington," he replied. 6 months later, Clara Washington walked through the pristine, beautifully redesigned corridors of the newly christened Lily Cross Memorial Medical Center, wearing a perfectly tailored, brilliant white lab coat that commanded absolute, instant respect from every single person in the building. She was the most feared, the most respected, the most brilliant surgical mind in the entire state, running a massive, state-of-the-art trauma bay where competence was the only currency that mattered. Preston Vance never practiced medicine again. His name became a toxic punchline in the industry. He was forced into bankruptcy, fighting a massive wave of federal malpractice lawsuits, disappearing completely into the obscure silence he had once forced upon others. Clara walked into her massive corner office overlooking the city's skyline, placing her stethoscope on the massive, polished mahogany desk. She sat down, leaning back in her leather chair, looking at the walls covered in advanced medical degrees and newly framed certifications. But resting squarely in the center of her desk, locked inside a custom-built protective glass display case where she could see it every single day, sat a single, rugged artifact. The snapped, broken piece of plastic from her old nursing badge, the exact badge Vance had ripped off her chest. She kept it there, not out of anger, not as a trophy of her wealth, but as a permanent, relentless reminder of the cold floor, the unjust system, and the exact moment she chose to break the rules to save a life, when the rest of the world demanded she obey. Yo, real talk, guys, this story right here is the absolute definition of vindication. We live in a world that constantly tries to tell you that your title dictates your human worth, that the piece of paper you have makes you better than the person standing next to you. Vance believed that lie with his whole chest, and it absolutely destroyed him. Clara knew the truth. Character and competence are not built in a boardroom. They are not handed to you because your father is rich. They are forged in the freezing dark when nobody is watching, and you have to make a choice about who you really are and what you are willing to risk. If you are out there right now feeling like you are trapped, feeling like the world is looking right past your brilliance, keeping you in a box you do not belong in, keep your head up, keep your skills sharp, and never, ever let a cruel system strip away your humanity. Because the universe is always watching, and your moment to flip the entire board is coming faster than you think. If this story hit you right in the soul, if you believe that true justice always finds a way to balance the scales, smash that like button. Share this with someone who is fighting their own invisible battle. And subscribe for more stories of undeniable triumph. Stay brilliant, stay resilient, and never forget that true power does not need permission to shine.